Thank you, Aaliyah, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm gonna keep my camera off because I think most of you know me, or if you didn't, you briefly saw me at the very beginning. I am very excited to introduce our speaker, our today's speaker, Ellie Higgins. Mary Ellen Higgins, but she goes by Ellie, is an associate professor of English at Penn State Greater Allegheny. Her books include Hollywood's Africa After 1994 from Ohio University Press, The Western in the Global South from Routledge, co-edited with Rita Kerezzi and Dana Oshervitz, and The Historical Dictionary of French Cinema from Scarecrow Press, also with Dana Oshervitz. She has published articles on African cinema and literature in the following journals, among others: Research in African Literatures, African Literature Today, African Studies Review, and now with apologies to those of you who speak Afrikaans, Tijdschrift Ver Letterkunde, again apologies, and Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature, among other scholarly venues. Beyond academic writing, she is an executive producer of Kivu Ruhorahoza's film Europa, based on a true story from 2019, and associate producer of two films by Jean-Pierre Beccolo, Mudimbe's Order of Things 2015 and Naked Reality 2016. Her next project is a book on the expansion of the terms of trauma in African cinema. In 2020, she received the George W. Atherton Award for Excellence in Teaching. I'm very excited to welcome Ellie to UW-Madison, even though it's done virtually, and I will give her the floor, so to speak, right now. So welcome, Ellie, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'd like to thank Vlad for inviting me here, and to thank Dina for her expert guidance, and especially thank you to Kivu for joining us. I know that it's later in the evening in Rwanda, and I appreciate your participation. You're our exciting surprise guest. If I stick to my script, I think we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. My script is about 30 minutes, maybe a bit less. So I'm going to read for the most part. So there are three experiences that brought me to this presentation. The first was the experience of being executive producer. I had the pleasure of serving as executive producer for Jean-Pierre Beccolo's film, Les Choses et les Mots de Mudimbe, and then on Beccolo's Naked Reality. And most recently, I was delighted to be executive producer of Kivu Ruhorahoza's film, Europa, based on a true story, which was featured in the official competition for Best Film at the International Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam in 2019. It was also featured in the competition at the Carbonia International Film Festival in Italy, where it won Best Film. Congratulations, Kivu, by the way. And the second is writing a book chapter. This is completely different. It's not what I'm going to be talking about. But I've been writing a book chapter on J.M. Coetzee's engagement with the Western genre in his novel and screenplay, Waiting for the Barbarians, which was made into a film in 2020, directed by Ciro Guerra. Coetzee's manuscripts and notations indicate that the novel's frontier town setting on a caravan trading route can be traced to an exploration narrative that Coetzee was reading, Sven Hedin's Central Asia and Tibet Toward the Holy City of Lhasa, published in London in 1903. My point in that book chapter is that some tropes of the Western genre were in operation already and internationally in the very same year that the first American Western, Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, was released. The point here for this presentation is that I can make that argument about Coetzee's manuscript because we have access to his drafts. In my capacity as executive producer, I often get the pleasure to see the storyboards, the photographs of early film stills, the first few versions, the changes, and I can see how much we can gain from a knowledge of what was not there in the final version of things. In other words, I get to see the film when it is unfinished. Manuscripts and drafts are studied in literary scholarship all the time. Why not study the drafts of films? Why not study, with the permission, of course, and without being too invasive, of course, the correspondences, the annotations, the different versions of films by African directors. Why not create an archive of the histories of those films? And then lastly, I was asked to present on a panel about radical genres alongside Monte Diarra and Ken Harrow at the ALA in 2019. And I started thinking about the draft as an entity in itself. I should start by saying that I'm not confident that the idea of the draft as a genre works. Therefore, I changed my title a bit. I imagine that going to Netflix and searching under its genres, drama, comedy, thriller, horror, and then seeing drafts. I think a lot of us would like to see the drafts of our favorite films, but perhaps calling them a genre is too much. Perhaps they are anti-genres. Mostly though, what I'd like to demonstrate today is what happens when we incorporate the draft into an analysis of a film, if we're so privileged to have access. So that leads to my presentation, What's in the Draft? Director Kivu Ruhorahoza's 2019 film Europa, which was initially titled A Tree Has Fallen, offers a compelling narration of its own generic transformations. In 2018, at the African Literature Association's annual conference, I presented a paper on A Tree Has Fallen, a film that, like a ghost, only a few had seen. In his initial renderings of the film, I'll refer to it as A Tree Has Fallen, the protagonist, Simon Adekolake, played by Oris Erhuro, is a Nigerian asylum seeker in the UK who has died mysteriously and who is now a wandering ghost. In her book, Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon's formula for the ghost, what appears dead, but is nevertheless powerfully alive, takes on another dimension in Ruhorahoza's film. Simon appears to be very much alive. He knocks on doors, walks the streets, returns to his lover, and argues with her ex-husband. But Simon is nevertheless powerfully dead. A Tree Has Fallen is a film, in the director's parlance, about dead Black men who refuse to leave. It is about the people who are meant to be invisible, but who dare to reveal themselves and who refuse to play dead. The British subjects Simon Ghost haunts are aware that he is already dead. They know that he is a ghost. The task of the film's British subjects, then, is to speak with the African ghosts, to piece together the meanings of his hauntings. I developed my ALA conference paper and published an essay on A Tree Has Fallen in 2019 in the South African journal Tijdschrift vir Letterkunde. I hope I get that okay. In that essay, I wrote this, and I'm quoting myself. For Zygmunt Bauman, our present liquid life instills fear of an uncertain expiration date in an environment of ubiquitous disposability. The haunting fear in liquid life, Bauman asserts, is that one will not adapt adequately enough to modernity's fluctuating demands, that one will be irrelevant, that one will outstay one's welcome. To narrate this liquid modernity, Bauman asserts, is not to tell the story of constantly emerging beginnings, but rather to tell the story of successive endings. In Ruhorahoza's film, Simon explains that after a death, one does not say that someone is dead. When one joins the other world, one says that a tree has fallen. In a similar vein, at the ending of the film, one cannot simply speak of death or an ending. The story of a ghost begins with an expiration of life, but it resists its expiration date. When I wrote that article, that's end quote, when I wrote that article on A Tree Has Fallen, Europa, based on a true story, did not yet exist. When I think now of Europa, based on a true story, in relation to Zygmunt Bauman's concept of liquid life, I think that Europa is not a story of beginnings or successive endings. Rather, it is in part a story of successive attempts. It is a story of successive versions and the events in between those versions. The draft is a work that has not ended. It is a provisional version of something that exists tentatively before the deadline, something in process of becoming another matter. Like the business of the ghost, the work of the draft is unfinished. And thus, is the draft, or could it be, a radical genre? In his 1955 essay about Roberto Rossellini's films, among them Rossellini's 1952 film, Europa 51, Jacques Rivette describes the draft in the following way, quote, hurried films improvised out of very slender means and filmed in a turmoil that is apparent from the images contain the only real portrait of our times, and these times are a draft too, end quote. I asked Kivu if he was thinking of Europa 51 when he retitled his film Europa based on a true story, and he said no, if I remember correctly. But when I shared with him the description of the draft, hurried films, improvised out of slender means and filmed in a turmoil, the response was very accurate. Europa, based on a true story, is a film altered and rearranged. Pieces of the original story about an undocumented, ghostly Nigerian in London are still there, alongside an artful mix of quasi-ethnography, autobiographical film essay, explication du texte, draftiness, and ghost story. It is a film, to reiterate Rivette, filmed in a turmoil that is apparent from the images. A Tree Has Fallen tells us about Simon's failed attempts and appeals for asylum. Europa tells us about the attempts of an African filmmaker with an African passport to make a film in Europe. The opening scene begins with the autobiographical reflections of an African filmmaker in voiceover narration about making a film out of Africa. The filmmaker narrates, this shot was captured on the Sony A7S2 camera. Is it funny to hear me narrating this here? This shot was captured on the Sony A7S2 camera. I long hesitated to make a film with this camera because I dreaded the reaction of my colleagues who would be surprised to see me shoot my third feature film with a semi-professional camera. This shot was captured on the Red Scarlet camera with an RE Ultra 24mm lens. This camera kit assures my professional collaborators they immediately understand that this is a serious production. These matters are not trivial. I, an African filmmaker with an African passport, cannot survive a third feature film that does not look professional enough unless the said film was so thematically important to the point that critics and programmers would be willing to overlook its flaws. As far as I could remember, I had always wanted to make a Rwandan film set in a European country. My well-meaning professional friends were advising me to stay in my assigned place and to make a third feature film set in Africa with universal themes. I had one in mind about infidelity in a couple, rather banal and universal theme, but the story would be set in a European city and the title would be A Tree Has Fallen. The story for A Tree Has Fallen exists within Europa based on a true story. When asked at film festivals how A Tree Has Fallen transformed into a blended genre that incorporates elements of the documentary, Ruhorahoza responded that something was missing. A Tree Has Fallen is a film then, like a draft, that had not yet found what would complete it. But if a genre is something that is recognizable, then how would we recognize the draft? Perhaps the draft is not a genre after all, and I use this premise to confuse everyone. Perhaps the better term is essay, for at the root of the essay film is the word essayer, to attempt. As Nora Elter asserts, quote, whatever defining secondary features the essay may have qua genre, a basic one remains that it is precisely not a genre, since it strives to be beyond formal, conceptual, and social constraints. Like Adorno's literary essay, Alter writes, the film essay is heresy. It disrespects existing boundaries, end quote. In its meditation on borders, migration, ghosts, belonging, filmmaking, and Brexit, Europa blends film essay, quasi-ethnographic scenes of various street demonstrations in London, and more pointedly, their stages, their props, their clothes, their costumes, and their symbols. In a reverse ethnography, Reminiscent of Monthia Diarra's Rouge in Reverse, Ruhorahoza documents clashes between the right-wing pro-Brexit Football Lads Alliance and the youthful anti-fascist Antifa movement, the blending of gay pride marches with anti-Brexit demonstrations, pretty people dancing and blowing bubbles, and protesters wearing Melania masks. At times, the demonstrators are quite aware of the presence of the microphone and camera. In one moment, a blonde protester is confronted by angry men who express anti-Muslim sentiments. When the blonde protester tells him he is Muslim, they curse at him. He approaches the police and says, "That guy says he wants to cut my head off." They've got it on camera. At other times, the sounds of the demonstrations are blotted out by electronic music, and sometimes the noise of the demonstration is muted by the voiceover commentary. In his voiceover commentary, the director reflects upon how he is taken in by the aesthetics of the demonstrations, but he admits, quote, "I couldn't help but feeling that protests were a form of social theater, performed for the sake of feeling useful and relevant," end quote. One often hears that radical genres render the invisible visible, something akin to the revealing of a ghost. Rather than render the invisible visible, this very striking scene in Europa renders a very visible, recognizable, and typically loud figure inaudible. Sean Hannity is talking, but instead of Hannity's words, we hear Ruhorahoza's voice saying, quote, "The language of American conservative media personalities has been adopted by British nationalists," end quote. Then the narration stops and the sound comes back. It is not Hannity's voice, but a British woman on stage with a microphone calling upon her audience to drain the smoke. Beyond the social theater of the demonstrations, the film takes a departure of what Ruhorahoza has called, in an abstract for a presentation that could not be delivered because of travel restrictions, a flash side. The flash side is, as he puts it, a detour into a parallel reality. The flash side for Ruhorahoza is, as he puts it, investigates why the utopia imagined by privileged characters is practically impossible to achieve. A woman sits alone at a picnic bench at a remove from the demonstrations. She does not speak. The filmmaker tells us that it is a haunted park. The images of the woman are videographic evidence of ghostly non-belonging. The woman has told the filmmaker that nobody knows her name or her location. This moment recalls what Jen Burstein calls radical vision, a way of seeing what one has been trained to look away from, a way of seeing what one is missing. What does resist mean, the director asks, to those living under Prime Minister Theresa May's hostile environment policy, a legislative unwelcoming designed to reinforce separateness and despair, to bar people from having bank accounts or to work, to prevent the asylum seeker from making a living, to make living conditions so stressful that immigrants will leave on their own, and how to resist when you are undocumented or living under the radar. Does resisting mean acting normal or as if one belongs? After his narration about performances and belonging, there is a cut to a scene from the initial story, A Tree Has Fallen, a scene that is left intact in the new film, Europa. In the story, Stemmen auditions for a play. Simon performs an improvisational scene set in an immigration appeals court in which his character makes a final plea for asylum. He recites these lines, quote, "The Home Office has challenged my asylum claim. They have rejected all my appeals. They have expressed significant doubts about my story," end quote. Simon then lifts his shirt to reveal the scars produced by bullet wounds in his stomach, where each bullet entered his body, suturing the performance to his somatic experience. Simon is compelled, in a hostile climate of suspicion and denial, to assure his audience that his claim is not bogus. The wounds, he adds, are not self-inflicted. Simon's protest against the subjugation of his narratives, of the suppression of his past by a home office that qualifies and disqualifies him at will, a home office that can toss his claims in the dumpster, is an act of political subjectivity, an act of playing a part. Yet it reads like an audition for existence. Political subjectivity and the rights of subjects are matters processed by the bureaucracy, cases that can be rejected and thrown out, things subject to expiration dates. Asylum claims, as Elizabeth Dauphiné writes, are treated as bits of paper that undergo judgment. The asylum seekers behind those bits of paper are denied their own faces, their own voices, their own skins. They are judged to be ineligible for life. In the theater of street demonstrations documented in the film's quasi-ethnography, there are shots set to the rhythm of non-diegetic club music of people in costume. The handmaids, the Statue of Liberty, the Queen. Among the various props are flags, alternative flags, and children with flags. In the fictional film, A Tree Has Fallen, one of the first figures to cross Simon's path is a man draped in the flag of St. George. The flag is a visual incarnation of a discourse that makes particular claims to Britishness and by extension to rights and parts that are assumed to belong exclusively to those with legitimate claims to this version of Britishness. The scene is reminiscent of Stuart Hall's description of a nation, quote, haunted by the fantasy of our late return to the flag, end quote. Simon gazes briefly at the flag-wrapped figures who pass Simon as if he is invisible. Yet Simon and other post-colonial asylum seekers and immigrants are very much there. They are at the core of the discourse on what it means to be British, of who is included and excluded, of who is welcome and where, and who has, to return to Bowman's analysis, succumbed to liquid life. In the new rendering of the scene from A Tree Has Fallen, there is a voiceover that reflects upon which part this character in the flag, with the flag plays. Is he on his way to a rugby match, the narrator asks, or is he a nationalist on his way to one of the many right-wing protests in the city? This man is, by the way, the film's lighting technician, Dimitri Lambridis, playing a part. Another scene from A Tree Has Fallen that remains intact in Europa is a scene in which Simon, in his ghostly form, visits Bruce, played by Matt Ray Brown, the theater director who was once married to Simon's lover, Anna, played by Lisa Morish. Bruce tells Simon's ghost that he has some nerve showing up at the door. Bruce gives an order to the ghost, get out of my house. Get out of my house. Words that suture the film narrative to the hostile environment of unwelcoming outside of the film. Several claims are made upon ghosts. Ghosts, too, have their assigned roles. For Derrida, the dead are indeed dead, but, he qualifies, just because the dead no longer exist does not mean that we are done with specters. For Gordon, ghosts are messengers. They reveal to us a living inheritance. As Paul Gilroy recalls, the post-colonial immigrant in melancholic Europe, quote, is here because Britain, Europe, was once there, end quote. Ghosts, Ruhorahoza comments in a voiceover narration that echoes Gordon, are characteristically attached to things that produced them in the first place. While immigrants from formerly colonized spaces are depicted as strangers at the door, they are not strangers to the history of imperialism, to those ghostly, unsettled, and unsettling histories in which the question of who is host and who is guest, who is foreign or strange and who is allowed to make oneself at home in the world are entangled. In A Tree Has Fallen, several scenes feature Simon's ghost at the door. He enters his old apartment, visits his friendly ex-landlady. He is welcomed by Anna, who has been hoping for his return. What rattles the character Bruce the most, and what Bruce attempts to police, is this welcoming of the ghost. In my essay on the original film, I wrote, and I'm quoting myself here, like the ghost, A Tree Has Fallen does not settle on an ending. If there is a settling in this ghostly narrative, a settling and not an ending, the narrative settles on the movements of ghosts. Whereas the asylum seeker is hemmed in, the ghost, as Ishu Mbembe's meditation on Amos Tutuola's work tells us, a wandering subject. As a ghost, Simon is not only free to wander, but to haunt. And as Gordon writes, haunting is one way in which abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impacts felt in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, or when their impressive nature is denied. Both A Tree Has Fallen and Europa feature a recitation of Virago Diop's Souffle, or spirits, at the beginning. For Simon, haunting is not only a matter of refusing to be rendered invisible, but a way of saying, as in the poem, that the dead are not dead. The dead are everywhere, not only in the paling shadow, in the rustling tree, in the groaning wood, in the crowd, but at the front door, ringing the bell. If there is an alternate model for coexistence in the film that defies the social and spatial assignments managed by the police, it is the ancestors moving. The model of the borderless world of the ancestors is a stark contrast to present zones of managed policed existence. Yet the proposition of being free to wander only after death is unsettling. Simon returns as a witness from the inside of death. Moreover, as Dauphiné remarks about the banning of migrants, quote, in the fictive logic of the sovereign ban, death does not happen. The dead did not die if they were constituted as subjectless in the first place, end quote. If the draft can be conceived of as a genre, it is recognized by its state of unsettlement. In the previous conclusion to the earlier unreleased version of the film, A Tree Has Fallen, Simon joins the ancestors and his lover Anna recites the poem Spirits on the rooftop, where it is suggested Simon, in despair, jumped to his death before becoming a ghost. In Europa, based on a true story, the poem is still there at the beginning, but in the new conclusion, one no longer hears the beautiful words of Diop's poem. In its place, there is a voiceover narration about sounds that have haunted the filmmaker. The director appears in the scene with his microphone. He says that he is haunted by the sounds of a man who, like other asylum seekers, is required to report ritually to the Home Office. The man's voice is then heard, but he is not seen. The man complains passionately that he has no money for transport, no right to work, no bank account, no travel, no way to see his daughter. The end credits roll to the haunting sound of his pleas. The Europa that I have been speaking about, this version seen at film festivals, contains an aesthetically complicated, politically engaged essay, an unauthorized home movie about, about Theresa May's Home Office and its hostile environmental policy. Made in a turmoil and improvised out of slender means, it is also an explication of its original manuscript, which removes viewers from the original story and opens up formally imperceptible directorial decisions. To write an essay about the draft is to write about its omissions and additions. As Gordon asserts, to write stories concerning inclusions and exclusions is to write ghost stories. I've seen the various cuts of the ghost story, which are no longer the same ghost story. Louis Althusser once wrote that oversight is not about the object, it is about the site. Seeing the drafts might make some of my words on this page appear as if I perceived things that are not here, but they existed in the drafts. Okay, I think we have enough time then to discuss. I hope that you enjoyed that, and I'd just like to thank Kivu for joining us and for being open to responding. And if you don't mind, I'm sure that you don't really need an introduction, but perhaps there are a few who do not know Kivu. He beams to us from Rwanda very this evening. He's well known internationally for his narrative feature film Gray Matter, which won the jury's special mention for Best Emerging Filmmaker at Tribeca in 2011. His second feature, Things of the Aimless Wanderer, premiered at Sundance in 2015, I think. And his most recent film, Europa, based on a true story, premiered at the International Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam and won Best Film at the Carbonia International Film Festival. So I guess I can open it up here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I will leave it up to Kivu if he wants to say a few words as people are preparing their questions. As a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand, but you don't have to, no pressure. You can just take questions as they come. Perhaps there might be questions that are addressed both to Ellie and to Kivu or separately. It's up to you. So yeah.
Thank you, Ellie, for the brilliant presentation. It's always a pleasure to see somebody talking about the film in such an eloquent way, because you were there from the beginning and then you saw the whole process, and I hadn't seen the film for over a year and a half, probably, yeah, for over a year, and and it's always weird to see all these images from London and be reminded of how the film came to be Europa. And thank you to Diana from McKinwood for inviting me, and Vlad and everybody else. I don't know if the participants or the guests had a chance to see the film, but I guess the questions would be more for Ellie for her presentation, and not for me as the director. I'm actually learning a lot about the film, because unfortunately there was not a lot of reviews of the film, because it came at a particular moment, and then we had not hired a press attaché, and then there was the pandemic, so the film didn't have a lot of literature written on it, for people to have a deep understanding of what I was trying to do with it. So I guess the questions should be more for Ellie for a brilliant presentation.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you for being here. So again, you can put your questions in. I have a number of questions, but I don't like asking my own questions. Also, I feel that if I wrote to Ellie later, she would answer my questions in a different format too. But I did have, as people are thinking about their questions, and perhaps this could be addressed by either of you or both of you. And I was thinking about, I love this idea of the draft as a genre, and if it were to become sort of an established genre, I actually have a question about genre to begin with, but I'm gonna skip over that right now. I'm thinking more in terms of sort of distribution, right? So watching successive versions of a film is very interesting to me as a scholar, to you, Ellie. Is there an application of this sort of for the real world? Like in terms of distribution, how would this look like? Would this mean successive sort of launches of the same film in different formats? Would it be in a DVD format that has several versions of it? So I guess that it's a more practical question to begin with, and you can start. And if Kivu has any ideas, or that's fine too. But we'll start with you.
Yeah, I was because I've been working with literary manuscripts, and I also am the review editor for Resources for American Literary Study, which focuses primarily on archival research. So that means biographies and letters, and there are so many archives available. We just thought how wonderful it would be, with the director's permission and for posterity, to be able to see other versions of a film that the director is willing to share, and to be able to see its various incarnations. How that would happen, I think Kivu can speak better to what you save and what you don't, or whether or not you can show various versions of a film at different festivals or in different locales. I mean, this is just something that I wanted to start thinking about because I think that it's so interesting. And it's interesting, you know, not only in itself, but it also, I think, enriches our interpretations of films when we can see its various manifestations.
Okay.
Would you like to add something?
I wouldn't feel comfortable showing different versions. I actually even feel a bit not always comfortable showing the latest version because again, this is a film that's not funded by the regular bodies that fund cinema, and I actually raised the point of the funding schemes available for directors from Africa who hold an African passport, because these funding institutions have very clear, very restrictive eligibility criteria, and then they make it impossible for me to make a film outside the geographical limits of Africa. So it's a film that was made on a shoestring budget, and it was finished in a bit of rock and roll kind of like energy, trying to beat the deadlines to show it at the International Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam. So even the latest version, I mean, watching it on a big screen for me is I can only see things I could have done better. So showing other versions that are work in progress is absolutely I wouldn't want that. I personally wouldn't want that because again, even the latest version, the latest version still look like a work in progress for me. I try to protect myself by mentioning some of the issues that came with making this film and the conditions I made it in, but still, it shouldn't be an excuse. The fact is, I just can't. I can't show previous versions. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Ellie gets to see them. Ellie gets to see them as an executive producer and as a friend. But yeah, but it's not. Yeah, it's not a good thing to show them.
I disagree, but it's up to you, not up to me, for sure.
Well,
do you think that you know, I hear that from filmmaker friends of mine, that there is constantly this idea that what you've done is not finished, right? And so I think that's part of what I was getting at too, is when you speak of the film that's already won awards at festivals, you see it as something that is still a work in progress, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vlad. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. I'm just listening to you guys. That's great. I kind of anticipated that answer from Kivu. I wonder, as a scholar, there is this sort of great tradition in terms of director commentary for DVD editions of films, and we lack that. And so if you have a final version of a film, one that eventually gets released on DVD as extra features, having commentary from the director on the final version could be construed as sort of a look back towards a draft form, but not the draft form. I'm not saying do that. That just popped into mind. We do have a question. Before I get to it, I wanted to also say, Ellie, that I absolutely love the idea of an archive of letters and exchanges between executive producers and authors or filmmakers, or between filmmakers themselves would be even more interesting, because I'm always concerned about level of sort of openness during interviews, directors who have to talk up a film. So as sort of to create a history of sorts of a film or of a creative process, I would be fascinated by having access to these sort of thoughts and exchanges between filmmakers in a sort of 19th century tradition of French novelists, for example, or poets. So I find that idea fascinating. First question here from the public comes from Renee, and it's for Kivu. I don't know if you guys can see it, but I will read it. And it's a question about ghosts. What ideas about ghosts influenced your film? Are these coming in part from the classical cultures of the Great Lakes region? I haven't seen the film, but I suspect these would shape to some extent how I received its messages, thinking of Muzimu, Bazimu, Kubamwa. As the draft evolved in Europa, did the concepts of haunting change? And I love this question because I've been very interested myself in ghosts and representations of ghosts, especially since we have Atlantics from 2019, which seems to sort of touch on traditions of ghosts, both in terms of European history and also in terms of African traditions. So any response here, perhaps, about the influence of ghosts, or where do they come from? What cultures are we talking about?
Well, I read a little bit about the Akan people of West Africa and their notion of how they understand dying and the kind of vocabulary that they've developed around the passing of a loved one. Thus, the title "A Tree Has Fallen" that comes from the Akan people, but the whole idea of which is central to the journey of my character Simon, the whole idea of two worlds coexisting: the world of Abazimu and the world of Abazima. The world of Abazima is the world of the living, and the world of Abazima, the world of the departed, and those worlds are constantly in communication. And I also gave Simon a little bit of because Simon is understood to be a formerly religious person. We see him visiting his former religious leader. But I gave him this spirituality that's very Rwandan and very East Central African in a sense, which is the absence of the notion of sin. In our ancient religion in Rwanda, the notion of sin didn't exist. Sin was seen as betrayal. You betray nature, and that's considered to be a sin. You betray people who have put trust in you, your children, your partners, your king. Betraying them was equal to sin. So we didn't have a word for sin. We didn't, yeah. And the whole notion of once you are gone, you are never really gone. It's very Rwandan in a sense, because I borrowed from our culture of which is called guterekera. It's a ritual to remain in contact with our ancestors, so that we can be at peace with ourselves. It's not that mystical. It's more of an understanding of what we carry from our ancestors that makes us who we are, and that makes us interact with the world. Because I mean, my voice, if somebody gets seduced by my voice, I get my voice from my vocal cords, and they come from like the genes that I got from my ancestors. If if I'm allergic to something, that allergy developed from somewhere. So it's very scientific if you want. So I gave Simon that notion, that religious kind of layer, and I also took the poem of Birago Diop and made it central to his journey as a character. looking at as the departed, looking at the departed as our ever constant companions. They're there with us all the time. They live with us. They haunt places that we visit. They haunt like they are there in the flowing river. We live with them. So it was more of a sense. It was more of a composite kind of belief system that I gave to Simon, and but he heavily borrowed from my Eastern Central African spirituality. Yeah.
Thank you. I can keep going with my own questions, but I'll give somebody else an opportunity. Perhaps you want to raise your hand and we can hear your voice. Just wait a couple of seconds. Okay, I'll keep asking a question. I don't know how comfortable I am with long silences, so just kidding. Ellie, could I actually, speaking of ghosts, I really love what you did with sort of the using secondary sources from Derrida, but also going into Diop and Membe, and some of the stuff about ancestors made me think of Shoinka and sort of the cosmic continuity in Yoruba traditions. And so there's this nice mixture of secondary sources here. But my question would want to move away from ghosts just for a second and go back to this idea of genre. And I just want to pick your brain a little bit about what do you think the importance of genre is for African cinema? And I say African in quotes because if we're talking about Nollywood, I saw my colleague Matt Brown in the crowd, and you know, might be easier to talk about genre in Nollywood. It might be more difficult to identify genre as, you know, in sub-Saharan Francophone cinema. So you have this conversation about the draft as a genre, but as is the case with a lot of things in and around the cinema from Africa, we haven't quite decided, you know, if genre is even a possibility in general. So do you have any thoughts about this?
I think there are a few thoughts. Genre, you know, the definition of genre is not really settled upon. I don't think that there is a wide agreement, but if we think of a genre as something that is recognizable, you know, a comedy or a thriller or a horror film that is recognizable, although it might be blended with other elements, then the question that I grappled with was, you know, what is it about the draft that is recognizable? And so I went to Vivette's description of Europa 51, which talked about films that are made in a turmoil and with slender means that are not quite finished, but yet he also compared that to the times, like that we are in a turmoil, that this is something that reflects a particular moment in time really well. And maybe there's a better word for it than draft, but that was the best word that I could come up with. So something that describes a film made in a turmoil that reflects in many ways the kind of turmoil that exists in the context of the filmmaking itself, which doesn't mean that the film can be diminished as or dismissed as just a draft film, right? Certainly not. And I think what I aim to do here was to show how this is, how genres are blended in Kivu's film. I don't know if he agrees, although some of the descriptions that I had of the genres that you were working with are based on things that you said yourself about the film, like the quasi-ethnography, et cetera. So I think it's really, you know, I don't think I can say anything definitive about African film genres, and by African I mean films made by people with African passports and who identify themselves as African. Although we know that Africa is not a country, so I'm just telling anybody to do that. But when I think of, I don't really know if it works. And one of the reasons why I like presenting is because I can get feedback. I don't know if the idea of the draft as a genre works. It might just be a condition. Go ahead, Matt, please. Or Kivu.
The idea of a draft as a genre could be interesting. Yeah, but the but the trouble with the draft again is he needs the presence of he needs the presence of the filmmaker to support to support their work, and it shouldn't be the case, and the film should just live on its own. And that's why I hate the fact that even with these with the final version of Europa that I have, I feel like I still need to add an extra few words to explain myself, as if I didn't, as if I was not clear enough, or as if the film was not completed the way it should have been. So it would require incredible levels of trust and self-confidence of directors to accept to accept any the birth of a new genre, and this one being the draft. It would be it would be quite it would be quite interesting to see how other directors react to it. But what's interesting is there are lots of abandoned, not abandoned, but kind of shelved films that are left unfinished because of various reasons, because the director had a stroke, or they ran out of finance, or there was copyright issues. There's so many of them that I wonder if there's I wonder if those could be added to the genre that you're creating.
Okay.
It could be interesting to see.
Yeah. I see my colleague Matt Brown raised his hand, and I'm going to give him the opportunity to ask this question, which is fortuitous because I had a very large question and very cheesy question about the state of African cinema, again, quote unquote, African cinema, and the future of African cinema. So I'm just going to let Matt ask this question, and we're about 4 minutes to the end, so it might be the last question.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Ellie. So I'm sorry, my question might actually cover ground you've already covered. I'm kind of in and out. I'm teaching soon, and I'm serving lunch to my 8-year-old homeschooler. But I've been, just especially of late, like really enjoying this conversation about draft as genre and what it could mean, and all these different possibilities, and the kind of unfinished films it could bring into, like, you know, their own sort of circulation under their own terms. So I was just simply going to kind of riff on that. I was going to ask if you've thought at all about it in terms of a horizon of expectations, you know, that way of thinking about genres, that, you know, that what makes, you know, instances of specific genre films interesting is that there's a set of expectations for them, but then they have the opportunity to subvert those expectations, that the draft sets up this expectation that it's unfinished, but that, you know, maybe no film is ever finished, you know, and if the draft, you know, sort of presents itself as the unfinished version, maybe it gets to do more than the supposedly finished version of a film gets to do, you know, maybe it gets to where the supposedly finished version of the film is burdened by a kind of like full stop or a period to say, I've said my message. You know, the draft doesn't have that burden, and perhaps it's and it would then subvert its own expectations by being more final than the actual final film, you know, because it would say what is final is that it's not final. What's final is that I haven't said everything that I want to say, but, you know, but no film can do that quite. So here's, you know, here's my quote unquote last word on the subject is that I don't have a last word, but here's where I am at this point. Does that make sense? You know, and I wonder if that's at all, you know, generative or useful at all for the way you're thinking about these things.
It's very useful for me, and I'm glad this is being recorded so I can just incorporate what you said into this version of my essay, which is a draft, by the way, in itself. So thank you, Matt, for that, and I'll let Kivu comment on how useful he thinks it is.
Can I have access to these recording as well, just to watch? Is
I
it
think
big?
so.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we'll take care of that. Yeah. We're about a minute to to the end, unless you want to have any sort of final thoughts here about either what Matt said or in general, just so we don't end with me. I am very thankful for both of you being here and to everybody else who showed up, but I prefer if the last word was Ellie's or Kivu's. Anything?
Kivu, what do you think?
No, I'd like to thank you again. It's yeah, I hadn't talked about this film for quite some time, and yeah, and I feel like I'm so removed from the work and what happens after the film has been released. So it's always a pleasure to be in a conversation about the film. It really feels yeah, it feels not dead. Yeah. And thank you, Ale, again, and thank you, Diana and Vlad. It's a pleasure to be involved in this.
Yes, absolutely. Pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Kivu. Thank you. So thanks, participants. We'll see you next week at Africa and Noon. So, and we'll make sure to send the recordings to you. All right.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Have a great day.
Everybody.
See you, everybody. Bye.